I didn't begin studying the brain to prove that humans are capable of great things. I began because something inside me kept urging me to understand how the mind works, why some people stay clear-headed in chaos while others lose their direction from the smallest disturbance. And then I realized, if you truly want to become sharper, smarter, and more mentally clear, not to overpower anyone, but be present with strength and unshakable presence, you must start with something very few people dare to face: stillness. Your brain, biologically, is not designed to process constant noise, but you're living in a world that bombards it relentlessly, a world of nonstop sounds, images, information, and clicks that tricks you into thinking the more stimulation you get, the smarter you become. But no, that's exactly why you become scattered, exhausted, and disoriented. In my research at Stanford, it became crystal clear: an overloaded mind is not a learning mind. It's a saturated nervous system unable to distinguish what's truly important. And you know what? Real progress doesn't come from doing more at once. It comes from knowing when to pause. When I guide athletes, entrepreneurs, or individuals operating under extreme stress, the first lesson I share isn't about focus or memory. It's about slowing down. Heart rate, breath, thought patterns, they must all return to a foundational state in order to rebuild peak performance. The mind has its own rhythm. It's not a machine that runs nonstop. It's more like a lake. If it's constantly rippling, you'll never see a clear reflection. But when it's still, you see everything: behavioral patterns, weaknesses, unconscious reactions, and the untapped potential you've never accessed. The first thing you must understand is this: stillness doesn't mean uselessness. On the contrary, it's the essential state where the brain restructures information and restores energy. When you stop in silence, no screens, no interaction, no reaction, your nervous system shifts into the parasympathetic state, activating the brain regions responsible for deep awareness, sustainable learning, and emotional regulation. This isn't just philosophy, it's biology. The quieter you keep your brain, the deeper it focuses, the less noise, the more intelligence, the fewer distractions, the more depth. I've sat with some of the most talented people in the world, founders, scientists, special forces operatives, and they share one trait: the ability to sit still and observe. They don't react impulsively. They're not driven by external noise. They step back, see clearly, then act. And that's why they're dangerous. Not because they speak loudly, but because they see clearly while others haven't even realized what's unfolding. When you no longer react to everything happening in your mind, you begin to become the observer of your own mind. You're no longer a servant to your thoughts. And that's when clarity emerges. You begin to sense the difference between reflex and intention, between echoes of the past and true signals from the present. Your decisions become easier. You're no longer ruled by emotion. You're no longer fighting life. You move with it, conscious and deliberate. I say this not only as a researcher, but as someone who once got swept up in the chaos of the world and had to relearn how to be still. And I want you to know, you're not lacking intelligence. Your natural intelligence hasn't disappeared. It's simply been buried under too much noise. All you need is a pocket of stillness. The first 5 minutes are a beginning. And if you can't let your mind quiet down for 5 minutes, how can you expect it to hold steady under pressure, under change? Let them chase speed. You choose depth. They scroll endlessly, you sit still. They react, you observe. While they're exhausted from stress, you remain clear because you've trained stillness beforehand. While they run toward the noise, you walk with the rhythm of observation. This isn't magic, it's neuroscience. It's a discipline you can begin today. With one decision, pause, breathe slowly, and look within. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the condition in which wisdom can rise to the surface. In a world where everything moves faster each day, news, reactions, notifications, expectations, silence becomes a profound and necessary act of resistance. It is how you pull your mind away from the dominance of the external world and return to the inner landscape where true awareness begins. When I sit down with athletes preparing to compete at a world-class level, or with someone who has just experienced severe psychological trauma, the first thing I observe is not their capacity to act, but their capacity to endure silence. And you know what? Most people feel uncomfortable with silence because in that stillness, you are forced to face yourself. No filters, no noise to distract you, nowhere to hide. It's just you and your own mind. A neuroscience study shows that when you sit in silence, the brain doesn't rest as many people assume. In fact, it shifts into a deep processing state, activating the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, the areas responsible for thoughts about the self, memories, the future, and unresolved matters. In other words, silence is when the brain works its hardest, not to react, but to organize, restructure, and create clarity. When you learn how to sit in silence, take a deep breath, and do absolutely nothing, you begin to notice old thoughts resurfacing, things you didn't realize you had been carrying, emotions you once avoided, questions you never answered. They don't come to disturb you, they come to be seen. And when you're patient enough not to react, you'll see something very clearly. Those thoughts no longer hold the same power over you. They come and they go, but you remain. And in that moment, you are no longer controlled by your mind. You begin to control it. Silence opens the door to observation. Observation here doesn't mean looking with the eyes, but a kind of wordless awareness where you start to feel the energy of every thought, every emotion, every small vibration in the body, and the subtle responses from the surrounding environment. In that state, your sensitivity is amplified. You begin to notice things you once overlooked. A slight hesitation in someone's voice, a soft sigh, a tiny movement at the corner of the eye. You don't have to try to perceive them. They simply reveal themselves. And when they do, you just know. You don't analyze. You don't explain. You just know. I've witnessed the power of people who don't need to speak much, don't need to react quickly, don't need to prove anything. They sit still, observe, listen, and when they speak, the world goes quiet. Not because they are powerful, but because they are fully present. Silence has trained them to be that way. It has trained them to be completely in the moment, not pulled by the past, not pushed by the future. And that presence creates a gravitational field where others are compelled to pay attention, to slow down, to show respect. You can become that kind of person too. You don't need to change the whole world. You just need to give silence a place in your day. Start with 5 minutes. No phone, no note taken, no doing, just sitting, just breathing, just observing what's happening inside without needing to respond. When you practice that regularly, you're teaching your brain to tolerate uncertainty, to resist the urge to fill space. You are opening up an inner space where wisdom isn't driven away by noise, but gently revealed through stillness. And from that place, deep insights, timely decisions, and breakthroughs in thinking, everything begins to form. Without silence, you live in a constant reactive state, acting out of habit, believing every emotion, chasing every piece of information. But with silence, you have a choice. And that choice to not get pulled in is the beginning of intellectual freedom. You don't need to be silent all day. You just need to be silent enough for your mind to hear its own voice again, because that voice is not loud. It doesn't try to win. It only arises in the moment you stop, do nothing, and simply exist there as the observer. And the miracle is this: once you find that silence within, nothing outside can throw you off course again, because you now have an anchor. You have a wisdom waiting to be awakened just beneath the surface of your busy life. Silence is the key. Hold it, use it, and you will never see life the same way again. The winner in an intense confrontation is not the one who acts first, but the one who waits, observes, sees through every small movement, every vague signal, and strikes at the right moment. This principle applies not only in combat, but also in how you operate your mind each day. A reactive mind is always hurried, impulsive, easily provoked, and easily manipulated by its environment. An observant mind is different. It is quiet, perceptive, calm, and dangerous. Not because it does more, but because it sees more clearly. Observation is not a passive behavior, but a state of heightened awareness. When you observe instead of react, you give yourself a pause, and in that pause is where wisdom grows. You are no longer being pulled by noise, instant emotions, or old biases. You are creating space between stimulus and action, and in that space lies the freedom to choose. A mind trained to observe doesn't chase every thought that arises. It knows how to distinguish between real signals and noise. It doesn't react to unpleasant words, doesn't immediately answer unclear questions, doesn't make decisions when things are still vague. It waits, it senses, it steps back half a step to see the full picture. And it is precisely that retreat that allows it to go further. In cognitive neuroscience, we see clearly that the ability for subtle observation does not come solely from knowledge or innate intelligence. It comes from training. When you practice not reacting immediately, you activate the areas of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, long-term decision-making, and social awareness. This is the foundation of all forms of sustainable intelligence. Observation is when you listen not just to the words, but to the silence between them. When you notice a slight change in someone's gaze before they even manage to hide it. When you feel your own breathing shift because something inside remains unresolved. These things are not loud, but they are real. And those with deep observational skills will always know how to act with the greatest accuracy and the fewest mistakes. That is wisdom without show. A kind of wisdom that can only arise from inner stillness. Most people live in autopilot mode. They believe every thought is true, every emotion is right, every action is natural reflex. But when you observe long enough, you realize most of those reactions are just habits, unconscious repetitions, things you learned from someone else, not conscious choices of your own. And when you begin to see that clearly, you begin to reclaim control. You pause before you speak. You inhale before you argue. You remain silent for a moment before making an important decision, not because you're afraid, but because you understand. A precise move requires sharp vision, not impulsive reaction. When you live with an observant mind, you begin to notice patterns, why you always feel insecure in certain groups, why you procrastinate when a task requires commitment, why you become angry at a certain type of person. These things are not random. They have traces. They have causes. And observation will trace every invisible thread pulling you back into old patterns. Sharpness does not come from the amount of information you know, but from the depth with which you perceive. Truly intelligent people are not those who argue fast or react quickly. They are the ones awake enough not to react too soon. They see what others overlook. They read the energy in a room. They sense the smallest shifts in their own emotions. And because they see early, they act early. Without panic, without being swept away, they lead. A sharp mind doesn't come from forcing yourself to think more. It comes from learning to see more clearly. Every time you restrain a reaction, you are sharpening your attention. Every time you choose observation over response, you are training your nervous system to become more stable. You are building an internal safe space from which you can master the situation instead of being mastered by it. Don't confuse observation with passive silence. Observation is a dynamic form of awareness, where you listen not just with your ears, but with your entire body, where you sense not just with logic, but with full presence. And that presence, when deep enough, will make you the kind of person who doesn't need to speak much to be heard, doesn't need to prove anything to be respected, doesn't need to chase to move ahead. That is the wisdom of the observer, something that cannot be bought, cannot be learned from a few pages of a book, but can only be cultivated in every moment you choose to see instead of react. Observation is not about standing outside of life and watching it pass you by. It is not indifference, avoidance, or a delay in action. Observation, if you understand it correctly, is an active life skill a state in which you are more fully present, more refined, and more perceptive than anyone rushing to react. The difference lies in the quality of awareness. A reactive person only sees the surface. An observant person sees the entire structure. In the cognitive neuroscience training programs I lead, the phrase I repeat most often to my students is not act faster, but see more clearly. See a glance that shifts slightly in a moment, a hesitation in speech, a movement that's inconsistent between the hands and the facial muscles, a pause that lingers longer than it naturally should. All of these small details, a reactive person will miss, but the observer will not, because they are not just listening with their ears, they are listening with their entire nervous system, trained to pick up what others overlook. Observation is a state of dynamic stillness. You are not silent because you don't know what to do. You are silent because you are analyzing. You are connecting data. You are reading between the lines. You are sensing unspoken signals, a subtle tension in the jaw, a sharp inhale, a delicate shift in the rhythm of a conversation. All of it is data, and the observer misses none of it. They don't ask questions too early. They don't make rushed decisions. They let the world reveal itself. They don't force it to speak. They wait until it speaks truthfully. In that state, they are not passive. They are profoundly alert. I have witnessed individuals who spoke no more than 2 sentences in a meeting, yet captured the entire emotional undercurrent of the room. They knew who was hiding something, who was anxious, who was trying to control the narrative. And when they finally spoke, everything shifted, not because they manipulated, but because they saw clearly. That clarity comes from active observation, a form of attention without judgment, without the need to control, but with a heightened sense of awareness. This demands consistent training, because reacting is automatic, but observing is a choice. When you truly observe, you begin to see recurring patterns in others and in yourself. You notice who avoids eye contact when lying, who pretends to smile to mask insecurity, who changes their tone when emotionally wounded. And within yourself, you begin to see what makes you lose composure, what triggers your defensiveness, what confuses you despite an outward sense of control. These details are not trivial. They are the map of the mind, and the observer, when reading that map, always moves with greater precision. Observation does not make you passive. It makes you more proactive than anyone else, because you are not deceived by appearances. You don't need to make hasty decisions to prove anything. You wait to act when all the data is clear. You don't need to argue. You don't need to shout. You don't need to always be right. You only need to see, and when you have seen enough, you will know what to do, not out of instinct, but with intelligence refined through stillness and awareness. When you truly observe, you begin to see recurring patterns in others and in yourself. You notice who avoids eye contact when lying, who pretends to smile to mask insecurity, who changes their tone when emotionally wounded. And within yourself, you begin to see what makes you lose composure, what triggers your defensiveness, what confuses you despite an outward sense of control. These details are not trivial. They are the map of the mind, and the observer, when reading that map, always moves with greater precision. Observation does not make you passive. It makes you more proactive than anyone else, because you are not deceived by appearances. You don't need to make hasty decisions to prove anything. You wait to act when all the data is clear. You don't need to argue. You don't need to shout. You don't need to always be right. You only need to see, and when you have seen enough, you will know what to do, not out of instinct, but with intelligence refined through stillness and awareness. The important thing is that most of the time, you're unaware of these patterns. They operate at the subconscious level, where you think you're choosing, but you're really just repeating. A familiar question makes you defensive. A certain look makes you uneasy. A tone of voice throws you off balance. Not because the other person has power over you, but because within you, there's already a wound from the past. And that behavior unknowingly hits your blind spot. If you don't observe yourself, you'll never know why you react the way you do. And when you don't know why you react, you will always be the victim of recurring situations. No matter how much the context changes or how different the people are, the pattern remains the same. Inner observation doesn't require you to understand everything complex. It starts very simply, paying attention. Pay attention to how you feel when someone interrupts you. Pay attention to where your body tenses up when you walk into a meeting. Pay attention to which types of tasks you constantly procrastinate on. Then ask yourself, does this feeling feel familiar? Does it remind me of something in the past? Am I reacting or am I choosing? These questions will open the path that leads you to the root. And from that root, you can create real change, not just patch up the surface. When you consistently practice self-observation, you'll begin to recognize repeating response loops you had never noticed before. For example, you might realize that you tend to avoid direct questions, or that every time you feel judged, you smile to cover your discomfort rather than face it. These behaviors aren't flaws, they're traces. And if you are patient enough to follow them, you'll find the truth beneath, not to blame yourself, but to understand and heal. An observing mind does not aim to eliminate reactions. It doesn't try to become perfect. It simply needs to see clearly what is happening inside. And that clarity is already a step out of unconsciousness. You are no longer the one being led. You become the one tracking the process. You start noticing the moment emotions rise, recognizing recurring thoughts, identifying familiar behaviors you once believed were just your personality. The truth is, personality is also shaped by habits, and habits can change if you are awake enough to observe them each day. I have guided many people through psychological crises, and the first step is always the same. Bring them back to themselves through observation, not to analyze too deeply, not to find faults, but to reestablish their inner connection. When they begin to see why they're constantly anxious, why they always need validation, why they get angry most easily with the ones closest to them, only then can they enter the phase of change without resistance. Because the deepest transformation doesn't come from trying to fix yourself, it comes from understanding and releasing. You don't need to fully understand psychology to observe yourself. You only need consistency each day, a little stillness, a few minutes to acknowledge your emotions, a moment to pause before you react. Every time you do that, you're clearing away a layer of internal fog. And the more you clear, the clearer you see. And when you see yourself clearly, you are no longer ruled by the invisible. You begin to live from the inside out, no longer chasing external validation, no longer controlled by unnamed memories. You begin to act not to avoid the past, but to build the present. And that is when you truly become free. There is no action simpler than inhaling and exhaling, yet no action holds as much transformative power. Breathing is the first thing you do when entering life and the last thing you do before leaving it. Between those two moments lies your entire existence. And what few people notice is this: the way you breathe is the way you live. If you breathe quickly, shallowly, and disconnectedly, your mind will operate in the same way, rushed, anxious, and unfocused. But if you breathe deeply, slowly, and intentionally, your body, emotions, and thoughts will gradually stabilize in the same rhythm. Breathing is the only activity you can perform both automatically and consciously. You can't command your heart to stop beating. You can't will your stomach to digest faster, but you can control your breath. And through that, you influence your entire nervous system, endocrine system, and emotional state. Throughout my studies in neuroscience and my work training individuals operating at peak performance levels, I've found no technique as simple and immediately effective as proper breath control. When you breathe deeply, evenly, and slowly, you guide your body out of chronic stress. You signal to your nervous system, I am safe. And in that state, your intelligence begins to function with greater clarity. Your mind doesn't listen to what you say, it listens to how you breathe. You can repeat, I am calm, hundreds of times, but if your breathing is shallow, irregular, and tense, your brain will believe the opposite. Because biology doesn't respond to language, it responds to signals. And breath is the most profound signal you send to yourself each day. When you learn to breathe properly, you're not just calming your body, you're reestablishing the link between emotion, thought, and behavior. You begin to respond instead of react. You feel emotions as they arise rather than being swept away by them. And you act from a place of steadiness rather than being triggered by the environment. Breath is the invisible bridge between body and mind. When you feel anxious, afraid, or angry, breath is the first place to react. And it's also the first place you can return to for stability. The beautiful thing is you always carry it with you. No need for a quiet room, no elaborate setup. You only need awareness. A deep inhale through the nose, a long exhale through the mouth, a short pause at the end. Just a few rounds like this and you'll feel everything inside slow down. And when the inside slows down, the outside becomes clear. I don't teach you this as a short-term technique. I share it as a way of life, a way you can return to yourself at any moment. When under attack, when confused, when overwhelmed. Instead of reacting instantly, you breathe first. And that single act is enough to create a major shift, because the moment you return to your breath, you return to your power. You're no longer being pulled by circumstance, you're stepping back into your center, where you can see clearly, feel deeply, and make wiser choices. In ancient spiritual traditions, breath was never taken lightly. They called it prana, chi, life force, the fundamental energy that drives all activity of body, mind, and spirit. And now, through modern research, we've confirmed this biologically. Deep breathing directly impacts the activity of the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for attention, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. Which means by simply changing how you breathe, you're changing how you feel and think. No forced effort. Just one intentional breath and everything shifts. You can't control every event in life, but you can always control your breath during those events. And sometimes one deep breath is enough to prevent a wrong action, preserve a relationship, or simply protect your inner peace. Breath is not an accessory. It is the foundation. It is the starting point. It is the place you can return to at any moment and begin again with a clearer mind, a deeper presence, and a sharper, steadier self. No method is truly effective if you only apply it in times of crisis. Intentional breathing is no exception. If you only turn to your breath when you're stressed, angry, or panicked, you're reducing a profound tool to a temporary coping reaction. Breathing is not a trick to quickly fix your emotions. It is a foundation of living, a foundation that must be practiced like any habit if you truly want to master yourself. People who remain calm in chaos aren't stronger than others. They've simply become accustomed to returning to their breath every day, even when nothing unusual is happening. They don't wait for the storm to learn how to steer. They train in calm so they remain steady in turbulence. I've worked with individuals who face extreme pressure, athletes performing under millions of eyes, surgeons handling life or death emergencies, special forces operating in environments where mistakes are not allowed. They didn't become exceptional by enduring more than the average person. They had just one key difference. They practiced breathing as part of a survival system, not as a spontaneous reflex. They didn't wait for panic to breathe deeply. They had already been breathing deeply before and maintained it as a stable biological rhythm. When you make breathwork a natural part of your life, you're doing more than just regulating emotions. You are retraining your nervous system. You are recalibrating how your brain responds to stimuli. You are reestablishing the link between consciousness and reflex. And you are creating a space where everything can pass through without destabilizing you. Breath is your internal stabilizer. It doesn't prevent the storm from rising, but it keeps you from being swept away. There's an important biological principle. You cannot activate both the stress response and the deep relaxation response in your nervous system at the same time. One must give way. And the only thing you can consciously control to shift between those states is your breath, deep inhalation, slow exhalation, repeated intentionally, is how you switch off survival mode and turn on recovery, thinking, and creativity. This isn't theory. It's what happens in every cell, every neural network, every bioelectrical transmission within you. But that only works if you train when there's no urgency. Just like you can't learn to swim in a flood, you can't learn to breathe when panic has already taken over. You need to build the habit beforehand so when the situation comes, you already have a steady inner rhythm. Only when breathing becomes a part of your living structure will it truly reveal its power. And the beautiful thing is, it doesn't require equipment, doesn't cost money, and doesn't depend on the environment. It only requires one thing: your commitment to yourself. Instead of starting your day by grabbing your phone, begin with 3 minutes of deep breathing. No need for meditation, posture, no need to force anything. Just inhale fully, hold for a few seconds, and exhale slowly. Those 3 minutes can change the tone of your entire day. Before walking into a tense meeting, instead of preparing arguments, prepare your inner steadiness through your breath. Before reacting to a negative comment, take a step back and breathe. Not to suppress, but to choose your response with awareness. Every moment you choose to breathe before reacting is a moment you teach your nervous system that it doesn't need to live in constant alarm. And the interesting thing is, the more often you practice breathing, the less you'll need it in moments of crisis, because your nervous system will gradually learn to respond more gently, more stably. You won't just control your emotions. You'll stop getting thrown into extreme emotional states so frequently. You won't become numb. You'll become clear. You won't avoid emotions. You'll regulate them. And that regulation doesn't come from force. It comes from a physiology retrained every day through breath. Breath is not a tool for emergencies. It is a natural technology you've carried within you since birth. Don't wait until you need it to reclaim it. Start now. Each morning, each free moment, each transition, breathe with awareness. You don't need to do anything else. Just be present with each breath as if you're returning home. And day by day, that return will become your most unshakable refuge. In a world that never stops changing, not every thought in your head is true, and not every voice that echoes in your mind belongs to you. Some thoughts are simply echoes of past criticism, fears you unconsciously inherited, or limitations you've heard so many times that you mistook them for truth. But they are not. Thoughts are not commands, they are suggestions, and you are not obligated to follow all of them. True power begins the moment you recognize the difference between thought and truth, and choose what is worthy of space in your awareness. The mind generates thoughts the way the lungs generate breath. It just happens. But what sets you apart is not the number of thoughts you have each day. What matters is, do you become a slave to those thoughts? Weak thoughts often share familiar traits. They hesitate, justify, delay, and sow doubt. I'm not sure I can do it. I need more time. I'll start when the conditions are better. These phrases may sound reasonable, but they're really fear in disguise. And if you don't detach from them, you'll end up living a script that fear has already written for you. Detaching from thoughts doesn't mean preventing them from appearing. You can't do that. Thoughts will still come, still repeat, still deceive you with their familiarity. But you can stop identifying with them. You no longer say, I am someone who lacks confidence, but instead say, I am experiencing a thought of lacking confidence. That small shift in language brings a massive shift in perspective. You move from being controlled to being the observer. And from that place, you begin to regain choice. When you learn to observe thoughts the way you watch clouds drift by, not clinging, not pushing, you create space between yourself and the mind. And in that space, something extraordinary appears. Conscious awareness. You begin to question each stream of thought. Where is this thought leading me? Is it making me stronger or weaker? Is it coming from truth or from an old wound? The purpose of these questions isn't to overanalyze, but to wake you up from the spiritual slumber where every thought is believed just because it feels familiar. I've trained people who suffer from chronic anxiety, and what they had in common was this: they believed everything they thought. They assumed that if a thought appeared, it must be trustworthy. But after some time practicing observation, they realized the mind is not a flawless compass. It is just a channel of information. And like any channel, it can be noisy, it can be wrong, it can reflect an outdated reality that no longer fits who they are today. When you detach from weak thoughts, you don't become cold or numb, you become clear. You no longer act out of hidden fear, no longer get manipulated by old stories you've heard over and over again. You begin to act from awareness, from a place that is clearer, deeper, and the important thing is you don't need to think positively to do this. You just need to think selectively. Each time a thought appears, pause and ask, do I need to believe this? And sometimes that one question is enough to keep you from being swept away. Intellectual freedom doesn't come from controlling your mind completely. It comes from knowing that you are not your mind. You are the one who sees the mind working. And when you stand in that place, you can lead. You are no longer forced to react. You can consciously decide what to nurture, what to release. That is when you become the leader of your awareness. A true leader doesn't need to control others. They only need to control themselves. And so do you. When you learn to lead your inner stream of thought, you are no longer caught in emotional whirlwinds or manipulated by waves of doubt. You stay steady even when your inner world is stormy. You make choices even when your mind still whispers old limitations. That is when you don't just escape the loop, you begin rewriting the entire journey. Freedom does not begin from the outside world. It begins from within you. A person can live amid noise, pressure, expectations, and chaos, but if they are still inside, they are still free. On the contrary, someone can live in peaceful surroundings, untouched and unrestricted by anyone, yet if their mind is constantly pulled by fleeting emotions, weak thoughts, or unsolicited opinions, they are still imprisoned. You cannot show up with strength if you're constantly being manipulated by what others say, how they look at you, or the attitudes they express. True presence only begins when you no longer need to be accepted, when you are no longer triggered by rejection, when you no longer react to every signal from your environment. When you have inner freedom, you don't need to overpower anyone, nor do you need to protect yourself behind a facade. You walk into a room and do nothing, and yet others still feel the real steadiness within you. Presence doesn't come from the volume of your voice or the number of words you speak. It comes from the quality of attention you carry with you. A person overwhelmed by internal noise, even if they say the right things, will still be met with doubt. A person who is fully present, deeply observant, and acts from awareness doesn't need to prove anything because their every behavior already carries an undeniable clarity. But to achieve that kind of presence, you must go through the process of detaching from all unconscious reactions. You must train yourself to observe emotions without being led by them. You must be awake enough to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate you emotionally and choose not to play that game anymore. One of the greatest abilities of someone with inner freedom is the capacity to see without being drawn in, to feel without reacting, to notice without rushing to adjust. When you have that space between yourself and everything happening around you, you become nearly untouchable. Not because you resist, but because you no longer have weak spots that others can easily grasp and control. You understand that every compliment can be a steering tool. Every criticism is a test of strength. And every emotion you experience, whether anger, hurt, or joy, needs to be observed before it can be trusted. That steadiness cannot be created through knowledge. It doesn't come from degrees, social roles, or your follower count. It comes only from a silent inner training where you learn to observe every reaction, dismantle every layer of conditioning, and rebuild your foundation from the ground up. It comes from every moment you choose not to react. Every time you notice a negative thought but don't let it drive your behavior, every breath you reclaim when emotions rise, those small moments repeated over time form a new version of you, no longer led by chaos, but one who carries stability. When you have inner freedom, one truth becomes very clear. You don't need to claim others' attention because your presence already attracts it. You don't need to overpower anyone because you no longer see yourself in competition with anyone. You don't need to always be right because you understand that true freedom does not require victory in argument. It only requires that you don't lose yourself. A presence that cannot be manipulated begins there, where you stop trying to control the world and begin to lead your own awareness one moment at a time.